today I want to talk about something that is, I feel like it's actually an epidemic. I think it's something that we deal with all the time. I think it's subtle. And I think it's also something that almost all of us are dealing with to one degree or another. And so what I want to give today are some really quick and easy tips to overcome this difficult situation that affects us in our relationships. It can be related to addiction. It can be related to dysfunction in all kinds of ways. And so today I want to dive in on codependency.
Are you listening?
This is the Rob Scott Show.
Damn.
I mean, really, like, if we're not trying to change the world, what are we doing?
Yeah.
What do you think, Sarah? Does that sound all right?
That sounds great. And I'm excited because we've had this talk a couple times. And I think today we're going to have something brand new, be able to look at it in a new way. So I'm excited to hear where we go with it.
So wait, when you say we've had it a couple times, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, it's such a broad topic. So there's different levels that we can talk about. And I hope today we get to talk about it in a new way that's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And this is not a treatise on the whole thing. This is really just to kind of I think that one consistent thing that we're going to keep coming back to on this show is things that I tend to think, or we tend to think, are invisible or unconscious to most people, and figuring out how we can make people more aware, because without that awareness, you're just going to suffer from it, right? It's just going to be going on. And codependency is something that is it's so subtle, it's so difficult. In fact, the definition of it is really, really difficult for people to even figure out. Like, the experts kind of disagree because it's underneath so many things. And, my favorite definition is actually from a woman named Darlene Lancer. And the reason that I like it so much is it's super simple, and it has a lot of applications where, in my experience, codependency ends up kind of coming up for us. So the simple definition is this: it's a lost self, which is really interesting because we do something called identity shifting. We do this thing where you can kind of move your concept of self around, and how profoundly that changes things, and how if you can change who you are, who you think you are, really and deeply, that is the most profound kind of change there is. So let's talk about how codependency comes up in this. It's really where we can't function from our innate self, and instead we react or we organize our thinking around, quite often, other people, but it could also be substances or processes. Okay. So that's why I like Darlene's answer the most, because most people think of codependency as being all relational, right? Just about relationships with other people. And that's probably the most common, and it's where we'll maybe focus most on this today. But it can also be when we've kind of lost our own sense of self around substances, or even like a process, or like a workaholic, that kind of thing. And so what Darlene shares in her work is that codependency underlies all addiction, okay? But you can't really treat it until the person becomes abstinent or deals with the obvious addiction that's kind of on top of that. Now, all of you that don't identify as addicted or whatever, I have a couple things to say. Number one, you can be suffering from this and not at all identify as an addict in the least. And the other thing is that I think our culture is moving more and more toward more and more universal addiction, or escape of feelings, etc., all the time. And so this is really, really topical. But to help people understand how this kind of affects, what does like losing yourself mean? What is that? How does that kind of come up?
Well, and this is why I said this is a new way to talk about this, because like you said, people associate with relationships, and I love that definition of it, to lose yourself or whatever, because it just highlights how this can be something that if you're unaware, right? If this is not something that you've ever thought about, or this is a new thing or whatever, that can be very harmful to you. Because if you don't know that you've lost yourself, that seems like the root source to a lot of problems that you might be experiencing.
Totally.
So I think this is super interesting to kind of talk about it in a way that both covers the relationships and kind of losing yourself, or losing the awareness of who you are within other things as well.
Yeah. And so you actually start to lose kind of where you are emotionally. And, your identity is actually not as solid as you think it is. And again, we talked about identity shifting as this way of like massively transforming yourself. Whether it's you redefining yourself as an athlete, or whether it's you actually becoming okay in your identity as a business owner, or whatever that stuff is, right? For a codependent who's suffering from that, the actual first step is just finding themselves, right? Like, who am I at all? Because we end up losing our navigation of what we value, what matters. And instead, if we are talking about it relationally, if you ask a codependent person, like, what would make you happy? Their go-to answer is often, well, if my partner felt this way, or if they would start behaving differently, or whatever. But you actually lose your own kind of navigation about what really matters to you. You lose your own preference. It almost feels like a sense of decision fatigue, right? Like, well, what do you want to have for dinner? It's like, I don't even know. What do you want to have for dinner? Please tell me what we're having for dinner. And so how does this happen to us, right? I want to kind of back up to give an explanation of where this comes from. An example that I often use is, imagine being a child in a home with like an alcoholic, abusive father, right? And so at a time when you should, in the best circumstances, feel really safe and free to be in your own needs, your own interests, your own kind of learning and all that. But all of a sudden, this abusive alcoholic father comes home, and you immediately, to survive, you have to consider, how does my dad model the world right now, right? Are there dirty dishes in the sink? Is my mom behaving in a way? Is my sister doing something that's going to offend him? And all of a sudden we lose what's important to us to overfunction and be concerned about what dad needs in that moment, right? Because if he goes off, all of a sudden it might get violent, or it might get abusive, or it might get mean in that way, right? So oftentimes we can be coming out of an addictive or an abusive, kind of childhood, and that leaves us with this imprint of overfunctioning for others, right? Another way is, imagine being maybe a woman in a relationship with an alcoholic or a narcissist. Okay, it doesn't have to be just addiction; it could be like narcissism or something. Imagine over time, and you never had this, you came from a really healthy childhood, right? But all of a sudden it becomes unsafe to really take care of your own needs. This other person is so either dysfunctional or selfish, right? That it's not about you anymore. And over time it becomes easier and easier to survive just by meeting their needs. How do they want the party to be? What do they want for dinner? What's going on? And those needs of that other person could be selfish, in the example of like a narcissist, right? They just might be a really selfish, kind of abusive person. So they make you do things, or it's easier to just do things that they want. And over time, you kind of lose yourself in them. Or maybe it's that they're dysfunctional, right? Imagine somebody who keeps getting DUIs and all that. And so when their boss calls, you have to answer and kind of protect and lie for them. Maybe you have to do all the driving because they've lost their license or whatever, right? So because of dysfunction or selfishness or whatever, we can be invited over and over to start losing ourselves. So we can actually start having this happen later in life, even if you had, all this love and support and boundaries and all these things in childhood.
Yeah, kind of two more examples that I think of that are pretty common, and I don't want to gender either of these examples.
Yeah.
But a parent whose identity, is like codependent on their children, and then their children are out of the house, and they, have this "who am I?" or the career person who gets laid off or downsized and is "who am I?" Like, this is so crucial, because you have to be able to stand on your own, and if you can't, then you're building a really shaky foundation for your life that has a big possibility for things to go really wrong really quickly. And I think that's just kind of being aware of how this both works, can work for you or against you or hold you back or whatever. Like, it's so important to even examine it, even if it's just, in the 30 so minutes or whatever that you're listening with us today. Like, this is going to be massively helpful for you if you can kind of see it more. Yeah,
as soon as you see it, we're going to give you some strategies to deal with it. And this is not necessarily the easiest, because it's incredibly subtle. Like, it's not obvious like an addiction to a drug or alcohol is, where clearly, now we're in a problem again or whatever. This can subtly happen over time. And even if you know a lot about this, it can still seem like the right answer to put your own needs down and overfunction, or, it's a way to deal with stress and things. And it's actually in our culture. I'm going to talk about this in a second. It's kind of taught to us, right? We're in a culture where it's not entirely like the dreams that we watch in our movies and all that are sort of sold to us, and they're not the healthiest of dreams when you actually know what the proper developmental path is for an individual. So this is often thought of in relationships and kind of coming from family of origin, but I do want to list a handful of other things just to be a little bit more complete. This can come up from being brought up in an addictive family. This can come up from being in an abusive family. This can come from living with an addict presently in your life, which those addictions can be subtle, right? They could be addictions, it could be sex addiction or love addiction or, substance addiction or work addiction. I mean, it literally could be in all these different things. It could come from abuse or abandonment as a child. It can come from being addicted ourselves, right? Ultimately, it can be this underlying thing of your own addictive quality. So, not only is it related to addiction, but it is actually its own addiction, where there are 12-step programs like CODA, right? Codependence Anonymous and things like that, where people can go in and do work to figure this stuff out. So if we think about codependency, I like to say this, it's kind of two different things. One, it's a bit of a normal stage of development. And two, it's a bit of an epidemic, as I was sharing earlier, right? So how can it be both those things? Well, it's okay. There are times where, enmeshing, I shouldn't say there are times when enmeshing with somebody is good, right? Enmeshment is the word of where we kind of mix with another human being and we're over-functioning. We don't hold our boundaries. We may not even know what our boundaries are, et cetera. But I want to say that there is a time going from dependent to independent where codependency may be there, and it may not be the most unhealthy thing in the world, right?
Well, what about parent-child relationships, young children, parents?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that seems like a useful codependent.
Well, for sure, right? There's times when you're learning your own independence and you're not there yet. I wouldn't say that that's the dysfunction of codependency. That's why I'm sort of playing with my words right now, right? So there is a stage between dependent and independent where you're learning independence and you're doing those things, and that might be considered a healthy codependency, right? Where you're still not all the way out on your own. You're still a kid. You're learning things or whatever's going on that way. Codependency as a dysfunction, though, is a bit of an epidemic. And, it's definitely unhealthy when we get stuck in that place where we're not able to kind of lean on ourselves in certain ways. But that said, you can be in a healthy relationship and make decisions about what you handle and what you don't handle. And you may not be paying attention to the finances because your partner takes care of that or whatever. And I wouldn't call that dysfunctional codependency because it can be, okay? But what's really going on is it's a loss when you lose touch with what your emotions are and what's important to you, okay? It's not just not taking care of the finances, right? Let's say you have a partner and they take care of the finances. That could be a good way to kind of cohabitate, right? If that works for you.
Right.
If that partner dies and you can't figure out how to do your own finances, maybe that's not the healthiest thing in the world. But chances are, if you're independent in your way and you were just giving up that role, you'll be able to pick that up or learn that when it's appropriate to, or you'll get other assistance, or it'll be okay. Different than that is when you start losing yourself in what matters in someone else, right? Or in your work, or in a substance like addiction, and like we were talking about before. So it's literally when you lose yourself, especially emotionally. But let's talk about how culturally we teach this for a minute, because this is sort of the big, the conspiracy, if you will, right? Which isn't being consciously done by anybody, but the movie dramas and the plots that go into our storytelling are often talking about, it often like the movie will end at the wedding altar with the beautiful kiss, as if that's the end of the story. And that's
right.
For anybody who's been in a relationship, that's the beginning, right? Like that's not the end of anything, yet we're kind of coding for our children and even for ourselves, right? This, in one movie, if the woman is the main character, it might be a romantic movie where she's just got to find her man, right? She's got to find this man. She's incomplete without him. And then we've got movies with men as the center character, and he's got to find his woman, right? And it's that I'm incomplete without this other, right? As if we're incomplete without that fairy tale love story and the perfect ending. And then there's this stereotypical mother who's going out there like, when will you settle down and get married? Right now, that's not how my mom is. I'm sure there's, most moms may or may not be like that, but there's a stereotypical idea of a mom who's just like waiting. Now we do want our kids to be happy, and we think that comes in family. We want them to procreate, maybe have kids, whatever that is, right? But that idea of it's going to all be okay once you find your other, right? That is something that we sort of have culturally going on. And not all cultures are like that, right? There's Asian cultures where it's very different. And we're going to talk about independence, where they don't think as selfishly as we do in certain ways. And it's a side conversation that maybe we can bring up another time. But in the culture here, we're doing this in the United States, we're selling often this dysfunction that you're going to find someone outside yourself that's going to fix it for you, that there's a prince out there or a princess that's going to make it better. And so we end up with this challenge of, completing ourselves with love. And one thing that I like to say that's kind of funny, if you were to do a movie about enlightened people, it wouldn't be much of a movie because there'd be no drama, there'd be less problems. It would just be like, everything's okay, right? Like we're fine here and there's no challenge. And so in the story archetype of, situation, challenge, resolution, right? We're telling those stories over and over and over again. And I love these stories too. They're fun, but we should be aware that they're fantasy, they're telling a story, and it's not necessarily the healthiest way to approach things. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It totally does. And I have, before we kind of move into the next stage or whatever, I have some thoughts on this, and bear with me.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get there together. Mm-hmm. But what I was thinking about was the fact that often identity, and I guess we're going all the way back to identity, and I kind of want to do another pitch for why identity is important, and then also with the emphasis on it that you often say, which is doesn't have to be that complex. Like there are complex things that we can simplify down, and we don't have to be lost in the mess of what is it and whatever. But often I find it tricky because we build who we are based off of external things, right? What job we're in, and who our partner are, and what our views on relationships, and where we live, and all these things. And that makes sense to me, right? There's external things that come in that kind of define who we are. But also, how do you step into what's never really made sense to me is how do you step into a committed relationship, whether that's marriage or whatever that version is for you, without really knowing who you are? And it's like, well, how do I know who I am without all these other things? And I had this conversation with somebody recently, and that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier with this like slippery slope of if you don't have a sense of self, self or identity or whatever that is in the most basic way that you can, and you say, well, I'm going to define myself by my partner, by my job, by my whatever, my habits and substances or whatever, it's really detrimental to you, because if any one of those things, which is outside of you, so outside of your control, fails, then you have basically an identity crisis.
Yeah,
right?
You're crisis, like, exactly.
Who am I? But if you can walk in there with at least an awareness of kind of who am I underneath, what are my values, and then add on to things that fit with those, you're going to be set up in a much more sustainable life than if you build it off of things you have no control over, or things. Now, I know there's a give and take, and that's why I said it's kind of a tricky thing, right? Because how do you know what your values are without adding in these external, but like this really just, highlighting the importance of the awareness of knowing when, hey, I've lost myself, or I've not.
Well, it's a great point. And what's really interesting is, and I'll just say it quickly, right? You're not your job. If you're a fitness model online, you're not your abs, right? You're not your best friend. You're not your partner. You're not any of those things. And so finding really what am I, right? What matters underneath those things? Those are aspects, those are qualities. But if they go away, you're still here. And so the people that get attached to those, right? They lose themselves in those things. Now they're really like the guy who loses his job, and that's where his pride was coming from. That's where he thought all his value was coming from. Like that, literally, some people go home and kill themselves, right? Like people that can't be the pro basketball player end up, really like becoming addicts, or it just goes horrible because they've lost themselves because they thought they were pro basketball player or whatever, right? So, to what degree are you so attached to aspects of your identity that really aren't your identity. They're instead your job. They're, what your abs look like. They're a fun hobby that you do. Clearly your partner isn't you, because that's why they're your partner and not you, right? So not having that. The other level of this that's the bit of a different idea is this: we end up wearing masks really often. And this is kind of accepted literally women put on a mask of makeup before they go out quite often, right? So our culture has made it so that women, feel they have to put blush on or whatever, and then put on high heels and do these things that are uncomfortable and difficult. And then they've got to clean their face at night. And I forget which show I was just watching, but it was about the 50s or 60s in the 1900s. And this woman's waking up really early to put her mask on before her husband gets up every morning, right? She's like set up to do that so that she wakes up fresh and he never knows what she really looks like. But we're all wearing more subtle masks than that. Imagine the first date where we're sort of putting our best foot forward and all that. And when you really get to know someone, if it's healthy, there's less of those masks maybe all along the way, and you're a little bit more okay with who you are the whole time. But you get past the facade, the fakeness, the stories and all this stuff, and you actually know the other person. But somebody who's codependent and enmeshed is putting on a smile and being quote unquote polite and being nice all the time. And underneath what might be building up are huge resentments. And there's a lack of courage to share those, right? So we're wearing a mask, and then we're wearing another mask, and then we're wearing another mask. And we find ourselves maybe years later, not even really knowing who we're in relationship with, and them not knowing us, right? Because we've never had the courage to really share truly who we are. We've always been polite. We've not told them that bothers us. We've not really shared our dreams because we were embarrassed of them, or whatever it is for us.
Well,
right?
And maybe you never took the time to know who you are. And I think that's, to me, and it's just in a response to something you said a little bit earlier, the complexity here is that it can look the same. Like you talked about the example of, hey, if your spouse does the finances, you don't know how, and that's your agreement, that works. So it's important to not flex that judgment muscle that we talk about so much, because you really don't know, and it can look the same. So for example, I really love my work. I like to work. I work a lot. It's a priority to me. I know baseline, that's a value. That's who I am. That could look the same as someone who says, my work is myself. I am my work. And yes, there's some overlap in the two, but the thing is, it looks the same on the outside. What's happening inside is I'm checking in. Like, is this a value of mine? Is work more important than X, Y, and Z? Is this kind of part of who I am? Not if I don't have this job, then I don't know who I am in the world, right? And there's always a little of both, but that's the awareness. So your role in a partnership or a marriage, it can look like that, right? Maybe you don't do the driving, maybe you don't do the cooking, maybe you don't bring home the bacon, whatever that is, and there may be codependency there, and there may not, and you might not even know if you don't kind of check in and have the awareness. So complex, but also very interesting.
So let's do this. Let's add a model to this, which is super simple, really fast. But it's a model of development for the human animal, if you will, right? And it goes dependent, and I will add codependent as a halfway step there. Independent, okay, and then interdependent. Okay, so quick definition of these, right? Somebody who's dependent is a baby, right? Like a baby's a great example of somebody who's fully dependent. Maybe somebody maybe they're older, but they're developmentally challenged or mentally challenged, or something's going on that way, and they're truly dependent, right? They can't fend for themselves in whatever way they need. They have dependencies, right, to survive. What's healthy, if it's fully healthy and people are capable of it, we want to help that person become independent over time. And as you mentioned, as somebody's growing up, there may be areas where they're really great at being independent, and then there's places where it's not safe for them yet to be fully on their own, et cetera. And so we might call that partially dependent. Some people might call that codependent. Again, that's not the dysfunction of codependency, but that's a place where you're not fully dependent, but you're not independent yet, right? Independent is actually the final goal, right? We're not trying to become individually interdependent people. That's not what that looks like. we want to be independent, right? And this is, again, something that other cultures, they think differently about selfishness. They don't put themselves in the center of the story. There's some Asian cultures who, if you ask them about a story, they're talking about the context. And I think that's really interesting. And again, that's probably for another talk. But where we are here, what's healthy psychologically that we know is that we don't want to remain codependent. We don't want to remain in ways where we're dysfunctional and we're not fully independent. Most importantly, emotionally and mentally, right? And physically. We want to be physically independent. We want to be mentally independent. We want to be emotionally independent. When you do that, and two people that are truly independent, okay, and have the capability for that, they can have an interdependent relationship, right? And that looks really healthy because they actually bring their honest, true selves. They bring the health of all their abilities. They bring all that stuff. And that's the healthiest relating that we know of, is an interdependent relationship that's going on there. Now, again, you may choose to share tasks, right? One might be better at something than the other, so they decide to do it more. That's fine. But emotionally, they're not enmeshed and codependent. But what we're finding in our culture, as advertised and other things, is we tend to default not even to independence, right? We end up codependent, right? Which is less than that individuated state of independence. We end up enmeshed emotionally, mentally, overwhelmed, not knowing how to fully express ourselves, not fully proud of ourselves to be okay with who we are, having deficiencies that we don't even see about ourselves, whether that be in finances or how we feed ourselves or how we're taking care of ourselves in all these different ways. And where this comes up as a survival mechanism is often out of abuse and addiction and all those things. It is a response to when other people aren't fully functional or independent, and we end up over functioning for them. And we end up losing ourselves in that, right? So you'll get a codependent with a narcissist quite often. You'll get a codependent with an addictive person. A codependent can be an addictive person, et cetera, okay? So the short takeaway there is that the big time goal here that we're going for is how can we become independent? And what does that look like? And that's even difficult to begin talking about, because what the heck does that mean, right?
I was just going to ask you what your thoughts were on, if we're going to define codependent as a loss of self, then maybe would we define independent as an awareness of self or a solid self? And then to kind of take it even one step further, looking at it from the other spectrum, beyond addiction and abuse, is looking at if society's pushing codependence, is that them saying they don't want free thinkers?
Yeah, maybe.
That's kind of what I hear.
And again, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think anybody's like holding the things. I think it's what's attractive to a dysfunctional person / society is, what's the drama? How are we resolving these things? I mean, literally watching, a show like Jerry Springer or whatever, there could be moments where that could be like such a turnoff because you're watching so much dysfunction. But there's also times where it's like, get the popcorn out. Let's watch this, shit.
Right.
Really. Like you're just sitting back kind of enjoying the mess, right? And so oftentimes if we watch things that are less functional than us, also, it makes us feel better about our own lives, right? So if I'm not feeling great about myself and I'm watching some other, car crash, literally or figuratively online or on TV, all of a sudden I feel better about my station and I'm okay, right? Watching the show Shameless or something like that. It's like, oh, there are people that live like that. I'm doing okay, right? That can happen. But what I want to make really clear is what starts to leave you is really checking in with what you need, right? You start to get disconnected from your own needs. And so one of the hardest things for a codependent person to figure out is, what do you need, right? So again, I believe I said this already, we often end up saying things like, or feeling things like, I'll be happy if they're happy, right? If my partner would just, whether it's not use drugs or if my partner would just relax, right? If my partner would just feel better about who I am, or if they would just be a better parent or whatever, like we're looking over at other people, and other people all need to change, right? So we've lost our own agency. And ultimately what's happening underneath is we're blaming, right? We're blaming other people. Well, it's their fault if they would just do it. But then when we talk to them, we shift in, oh, how are you? It's good to see you. Like, what's going on? And the mask comes down, right? And so, we start to lose an ability to have preference, right? To know what we need and want. We can literally go to dinner and somebody's like, well, what do you want? And it's like, I don't even know. Like I've literally lost myself in a huge way. And all I want is that person's love. All I want is that person to make it okay. I've been trained and I really need, I'm enmeshed with somebody else, right? I've lost my own sense of preference and stuff. So we look outside ourselves, hoping that others will change to make us okay. All right. And so the move here is, number one is figuring out, what are my boundaries, right? Let's think about that. We all say yes and no to certain things, right? And what we say yes and no to are our boundaries, right? That's what we're doing. How many people listening right now just say yes to way too many things, right? How many, like your friends want you to come? It's like, yes. Can you do this volunteer thing? Yes. Hey, will you run this 5K with me and do a donation? Yes. And all of a sudden your life is filled up with everybody else's agenda. And you're going, man, where's my time for me? But I couldn't possibly say no to these things because my best friend might not like me, or my partner might like me, or my new neighbor won't dig me, etc.
Because you don't know who you are and what's likable about you outside of what you're doing.
And you don't feel like it's okay to be you. You don't feel like you're so worried about being liked and accepted, etc. That's such a strategy that you can't let somebody else be upset with you in some way, right? So I'll do whatever. And unless it's like the biggest thing in the world, and then if we do say no, we feel horrible about it. We worry, what do they think of me? What's going on with that way? Okay. So what we say yes and no to are our boundaries. And what's happening, boundaries is a huge word. I don't know how we got this far without that coming up. What we're really trying to do is navigate and create and become healthily independent with our own boundaries of what really matters to us, right? How do I, who am I? What matters to me? What am I saying yes to? What am I saying no to? What am I keeping out and keeping in? And so a really good question in the beginning for a codependent who's lost themselves is, and just check in right now, if you're listening, take a beat and answer this question to yourself quietly. Is there any way that you can improve your own self-care right now, right? Is there anything that you could do to do more self-care? And self-care, again, is vague. What does that mean? Well, are you feeding yourself okay? Are your habits around sleep all right for you? Or are you like staying up late to take care of the house for everybody and then getting up early to get to work for everybody else? And all of a sudden there's no real time for you, right?
Or just start with, can I answer the question, what do I need?
Yeah.
If exactly. You need a place to start with self-care, like if you don't have an answer to that question, start there.
Yeah.
Find out, what do I need?
Watch if you're answering, I need somebody else to be different, or I need somebody else to like me or feel differently about me, right? And so another step here is to learn to speak your truth, right? So be assertive with those needs. Once you've defined them, right? Be okay and be okay expressing them and be in that wrestling match, right? This is why there's like a 12-step program, because you can have a breakthrough on this and make a new decision and be different forever, right? It doesn't have to take time. But very often this does take time for us, because as you express your needs and you say no to a friend, what you will probably find is they respect you more. They actually know who you are and really choose to like you or not. And what you'll find is if you begin healing from codependency, you're normally surrounded by a ton of other dysfunctional people, because independent, healthy people don't want to hang around enmeshed codependent people. And so what's happening is codependency is thriving in this dysfunction. And so as you heal, you may need to make hard decisions about who's going to hang out with you. And if people really do stop liking you, it's more about them and their dysfunction. And as you continue to heal, you may actually separate yourself away from addiction or dysfunction or narcissism or whatever's surrounding you. And one way to do this is find other people who are healthily independent, so that you can have interdependent relationships where you're thriving and everybody's healthy and it's okay. Okay. So another quick tip as I'm rolling through these is you want to watch the narrative of blaming others. Right? It's one of the problems in my mind with therapy, not how therapy is supposed to be, but a lot of therapists get into this continual, how's it going? What happened when you were a kid? Oh my God, that's because your father did X, Y, Z, all that stuff. And that's true and important. And we do need to become aware of that and figure it out. But at some point we need to put that down and begin to take responsibility, because if you are quote unquote an adult in age, to become an adult emotionally means that you're going to start owning, hey, I had whatever parenting I had whatever abuse I had, and now it's on me to make the right decision. And so it's not fruitful to blame mom and dad and friend and partner, especially if I keep participating in it in my part, which is the codependency part. Now that said, if somebody's truly abusive, that's something that's wrong. You got to get help, get away, whatever that stuff is. But consistently, we want to move toward taking responsibility and owning and changing ourselves, because ultimately we all need to be independent and really start taking care of ourselves. Okay. side note, how do we stop this for our kids? Because this is a generational thing, this dysfunction that's, I really do think, on the verge of, or maybe a full-blown epidemic for real in our culture. It's happening generation after generation. So if your parents are either addicted or deeply codependent or whatever, and you did grow up in a lot of dysfunction, it's not your parents that we can just blame, because they probably grew up in a total bunch of dysfunction, and they probably,
Right.
they
Right.
did.
Right.
It's generational pain that we're dealing with here. So how do we stop it for our kids? If this comes from abuse and addiction primarily, if that's where we know this comes from, the short answer is, well, just love your kids, right? Love your kids, and that will fix it. And while that's a part of it, loving your kids doesn't actually prevent addiction necessarily, right? It may help, right? If somebody goes, there's a high correlation with trauma and addiction, right? There are, there's nature versus nurture, right? There are some nurture things along the way that can make addiction more plausible, but it also has a genetic component. It also got all these other things, right? So along with love, what's really important is to get yourself okay with boundaries, and then teach boundaries to your kid, which means that oftentimes your best parenting doesn't mean that your kid is super duper loving you in any one moment. They might actually be super mad at you because you held a boundary, but they're learning the lesson of and the importance of boundaries in their life. So just side note to parents and stopping this.
Well, I was going to say model loving yourself, model knowing your values.
Yeah.
That modeling is so crucial in parenting, and really, like, kids are watching you all the time. So whether you're actively parenting to where you think you are or not, you're always a model to your kids. And so if you model codependency, then you're going to have a kid that, that thinks that that's how it works. If you model self-care or being like, I'm solid in who I am, and these other things in my life are awesome, but they're not who I am. Like, that's going to take you far.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. So I love that. So let's begin to wind this down with, maybe a wrap up of some of these tips, right? It's about figuring out your boundaries. It's about having, and here's another one that I don't know how we got this far without saying, right? It's maybe we said it, but I want to really land on it. Self-love is kind of the answer to everything, right? In a big way. And, when we don't have self-love, when we don't have a sense of, I really feel capable of dealing with the challenges that life gives me. I really feel, okay if it doesn't all go my way. I really feel like I'm enough. I feel like I'm capable of being present, right? I can show up here instead of thinking that I need to get quote unquote there, right? Some other place where I have more, or it's better or whatever, right? Becoming an adult is really, it's across all the things that quote unquote matter, right? It's becoming an adult in taking care of your health, how you eat, how you move, taking care of your finances, taking care of yourself in all the ways, and ultimately creating boundaries around all those things that matter to you and being okay at holding them. And it doesn't mean perfect. It just means that as you found you've let a boundary down, or you've let yourself get taken advantage of in some way or whatever, you put those boundaries back up and you do your best to hold them. You become somebody who's mature, individuated, capable, healthy. You're somebody who can be your word, right? Because if you're not wearing masks to pretend you're somebody other than you are to be liked, you can actually let the world know who you truly are. And as you do that, the right people that really love and care about who you truly are will be the people that surround you. And all of a sudden you will have a really, really healthy and beautiful life. And it's one that is further away from addiction, which, with being addicted to social media and all the different ways that we can be addicted to, impulsive and just immediate trying to feel differently, addiction is more and more of a big deal. So does that make sense all the way through?
It definitely does. And kind of something else I want to share that it's been rolling in my head since you said, we're going to define codependency as a loss of self.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit of a side note, but it does relate to this episode and pretty much any episode that you hear of our podcast, is that we often confuse, I think, the words simple and easy. And I think that our goal, and you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, is our goal here is to give you guys some simple tips that you can apply immediately to be more aware or to have a shift. we're not selling easy, right? So easy is not the same as simple.
Yeah.
And these kind of things, knowing who you are, knowing what your values are, there are simple things that are easy to understand that you can apply. You see easy is interchangeable, but we're challenging you to do things that don't feel easy or don't feel good in the immediate, that are going to pay you back in many ways, that are ultimately going to make you be able to have the life that you want to have and kind of help you avoid bigger issues down the road. But I don't want our listeners to think, that this is easy.
Yeah.
But I do want our listeners to think this is simple. This is something that I can do. This is something I can relate to. And I'm willing to put in the time and the work. Because if you're not willing to put that work in on yourself, that's your value. You need to have more value to yourself than that. So that was what was rolling around in my head.
No, it's great. And I think, some of the things that can be easy and a lot of the things are not. And one thing that I say all the time is you can't do brain surgery on yourself. Some of these things are incredibly difficult to see on our own, right? And we just gave an incredibly complex topic that even the experts disagree on what it is. We gave it a 2-word definition. And I could have given it 5 other definitions, right? It really is. I alluded to how it's kind of enmeshed with addiction, and people are like, I don't get it. I'm not addicted, but I'm really suffering, and I don't feel like I have the relationship that I want in my life, et cetera, et cetera. I've said it affects everything from, relationships to like not being an adult to all these things. And then we're like, yeah, it's really simple, right? The simple part is to check in, like, are you good at holding boundaries, right? The simple part is, are you really authentic in your relationships, and do you really share yourself, or are you hiding yourself in some way? The simple thing is, do you know what you value? And the simple
do you know what your needs are? Not what are they? Do you know what your needs?
And ultimately, do you love yourself, right? Do you love yourself? Do you really, on a day-to-day basis, or do you love yourself only because of an accomplishment or something you have going on out there? Or do you have really a connection to isness and beauty and, the consciousness underneath, which I'm going to weird everybody. If you've never heard this podcast before, it's like, what's he talking about now? I don't know what that is, but there is a quality of being alive where you can literally be in love with the moment, where your identity, you're very clear that that's a thing on top of, your real consciousness, right? And this gets to where what we start doing in the Identity Shifting Mastermind is we really can show you how you can profoundly change when you understand yourself and all these mechanisms that are going on around you in a very different way. And so, and
if you can't, like a word that you've said, that Rob said a couple times in a couple different podcasts that I'm really kind of clinging to, is find the courage to do it, right? Like if it's not easy, if it is something that's really kind of a pain point in your life, like find the courage, be courageous, and put the work in for sure.
Yeah.
And know that there's like outlets available to help you do this. If you can't see it yourself, hopefully listening to this podcast has helped you.
Yeah.
But like I just don't want to discount the work it takes to for self-care, and not kind of cheer on the people that are courageous enough to kind of stare in the mirror about it, or to ask for help, or to sign up for a program, or hire a coach, or go to a therapist. Like, it's not always easy, but if you can do it, like, pat yourself on the back. Be really proud of yourself.
For sure. And the other thing is, often we need help, which is what we do, right? That's what we're here to do, is to help people that really want to get more clear on this. So, that's a good place to pause for now. Why don't we let everybody know that if you want to check this out, you can go to identityshifting.com. There's a way to learn more there. There's testimonial videos. There's all this stuff of what's possible if you come in and really get a sense of self-love, get a sense of real clarity on what matters, what your purpose is, what's going on, and ultimately how to hold boundaries and really do all this work. We do that with people in the Identity Shifting Mastermind. A different step is our product, Recode Your Mind, which is really, really powerful as well. So I highly recommend checking those out. If any of this resonates with you and you're struggling or you're suffering, there are paths out of it. And much of it is simple. Some of it is very, very hard to choose to do, right? In the beginning, it's very difficult to even go, is this what I need? And so anybody that wants to do the identity shifting mastermind, we ultimately end up on a conversation. I have you put in an application, we look at it. If it looks like a good fit, we have a call with you and talk about it. So there's steps to check out before you have to commit to anything there. But all that said, codependency, it is very, very subtle. It is very, very powerful, and it might be something that is deeply affecting you. So if you've never heard of it, there's great books out there, Codependent No More, a bunch of other ones that are fantastic to check out. Please do this work on yourself if you hear in this the truth that you may have somewhere along the way lost yourself. If you are from abuse or addiction or neglect or any of that stuff, if you're presently in a relationship that feels really unhealthy, some of what might be going on, it may not all be them. They're participating too, but some of it could be you and some of your own survival strategies and how you're using codependency to get by. So I hope this is really, really valuable. And whether you do it with me or do it with somebody else or figure it out through a book or other podcasts or whatever, just go do the work because it's really, really worth it.
And we'll put all those resources in our show notes. And, we would love to hear from you. So if you are struggling with something or whatever, reach out and or comment or like or share or whatever. We love hearing from you, and we hope this is valuable. So thank you so much for listening today.
That's awesome. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Have a great day, guys. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.